They did not begin as emperors. They did not rise from a single homeland or rule a single culture. The Kushans emerged from migration, moving out of the shadow of China, crossing Central Asia, and building an empire that stood between the world's greatest civilizations. They ruled through trade, faith, and connection, shaping Buddhism and commerce across continents before fading quietly into the world they helped create. This is the story of the Kushans, an empire between worlds. Before we begin the video, like the video, subscribe for more in-depth history, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. From the edge of China, the Yuezhi origins. They did not begin as emperors. They did not begin with cities, temples, or coins stamped in gold. They began as a people moving under pressure, pushed by forces larger than themselves, carrying their world with them across the open spaces of Inner Asia. Long before the name Kushan meant power, trade, or empire, there were the Yuezhi. To understand the Kushans, one must start far from India, far from the Silk Road cities, and far from imperial ambition. The story begins on the northeastern edge of the ancient world, in the grasslands and corridors bordering what is now northwestern China, a region defined not by borders, but by movement. The Yuezhi were a nomadic people shaped by the steppe. They lived in a world where survival depended on adaptability. Herds mattered more than fields. Horses mattered more than walls. Memory mattered more than writing. Like many steppe societies, the Yuezhi organized themselves through clans and kinship, not through cities or bureaucracies. Their lives followed seasonal rhythms, migration between pastures, negotiation with neighbours, and constant awareness of threat. This was not a marginal existence, it was a highly tuned one. The region they inhabited sat at a crossroads between China, Central Asia, and the steppe world. For centuries, this zone had produced mobile peoples who traded, raided, allied, and fought with settled states. The Yuezhi were part of this long tradition, neither isolated nor primitive, but deeply connected to wider Eurasian systems. What changed their fate was pressure. To their east and north rose a powerful steppe confederation, the Xiongnu, militarized, aggressive, and increasingly centralized. The Xiongnu reshaped the balance of power across Inner Asia. As they expanded, smaller groups faced a choice: submit, flee, or be destroyed. The Yuezhi chose to move. Chinese historical records, written from the perspective of the Han dynasty, describe this. Displacement in stark terms. The Yuezhi were defeated, their leaders killed, and their lands taken. These accounts are brief and biased, but they capture a critical turning point, the moment when survival required migration on a massive scale. This was not a single journey, it was a generational one. The Yuezhi did not pack up and leave overnight. Movement unfolded in stages, splintering, regrouping, adapting. Some groups moved west into the Tarim Basin, others followed river corridors deeper into Central Asia. Along the way, they encountered new peoples, new landscapes, and new opportunities. Migration reshaped identity. As the Yuezhi moved, they absorbed influences from the regions they passed through. They learned new trade routes. They encountered settled communities and other nomads. They adapted technologies, tactics, and customs. The people who emerged from this process were not identical to those who had begun it. This is how steppe history works. Names remain, but meanings shift. Culture evolves without breaking. What matters is continuity of survival, not purity of origin. Chinese sources describe the Yuezhi splitting into groups, some remaining closer to China, others pushing farther west. Over time, one branch rose to prominence, the group that would eventually be associated with the Kushans. But at this stage, there was no empire, only movement. The landscapes they crossed were unforgiving. Deserts, mountains, and grasslands demanded flexibility. Water sources determined routes. Grazing lands dictated timing. Every decision carried risk. Leadership mattered, but it was practical, not ceremonial. Leaders emerged through ability to guide migration, manage conflict, and protect followers. Authority was not absolute. It depended on trust and success. Failed leaders were abandoned. Successful ones gathered followers. This produced a society accustomed to change. As the Yuezhi moved west, they entered regions shaped by older civilizations, remnants of Persian influence, Hellenistic cities left behind after Alexander, and local Central Asian cultures with long histories of trade. Contact did not erase nomadic identity, it expanded it. The Yuezhi learned to navigate between worlds. They traded with settled communities while retaining mobility. They adapted to new political environments without surrendering autonomy. This skill, operating between nomadic and settled systems, would later become the foundation of Kushan success. But this lay far in the future. For generations, the Yuezhi remained a people in transition. They were defined not by territory, but by trajectory. Their past lay behind them in lost grazing lands. Their future lay ahead, unknown. Displacement carried trauma, but also opportunity. Being pushed out of one region forced the Yuezhi into contact with broader Eurasian networks. They encountered the arteries of what would later be called the Silk Road. Trade routes linking China, Central Asia, and the West passed through the spaces they now occupied. Movement placed them at the centre of exchange. Over time, the Yuezhi grew stronger, not because they conquered cities, but because they learned how to survive between powers. They observed how settled states functioned. They learned the value of coinage, administration, and religious legitimacy. They were learning without yet ruling. This long period of migration forged a crucial trait: adaptability without loss of cohesion. Clan structures persisted, social memory endured, leadership remained flexible, yet the Yuezhi were no longer confined to a single ecological niche. They were becoming something new. By the time they reached the regions of Bactria and beyond, they were no longer simply displaced nomads. They were experienced migrants, seasoned negotiators, and increasingly influential players in regional politics. Still, there was no empire. What existed instead was potential, shaped by hardship, movement, and exposure to multiple worlds. The Yuezhi had been forced out of their original homeland, but in doing so, they had gained something rare: perspective across civilizations. This perspective would later allow the Kushans to rule an empire that linked east and west, not through destruction, but through connection. But that moment had not yet arrived. At the edge of China, under pressure from stronger powers, the Yuezhi learned the most important lesson of steppe history. Survival belongs not to those who hold ground, but to those who know when to move. They carried that lesson with them across deserts and mountains, across generations and into history, where their name would change, their power would grow, and their legacy would reach far beyond the grasslands where their journey began. This is where the Kushan story truly starts. Across Central Asia, a people on the move. They did not move through empty land. They moved through one of the most contested, connected, and transformative regions on Earth. When the Yuezhi were forced westward from the edges of China, they entered Central Asia, a vast zone of deserts, mountains, river valleys and oasis cities that had linked civilizations for centuries. This was not a single road or a clear destination. It was a web of routes, dangers, exchanges, and possibilities that would reshape them completely. This was the world that would turn migrants into empire builders. Central Asia was never merely a corridor, it was a filter. Every people who passed through it changed, or disappeared. Survival required adaptation to new climates, new economies, and new political realities. The Yuezhi arrived not as conquerors, but as displaced nomads carrying memory, herds, and experience. What they encountered forced transformation. The land itself demanded it. The open, grasslands of the eastern steppe gradually gave way to deserts like the Taklamakan, high mountain passes of the Pamirs and Tian Shan, and narrow green belts surrounding oasis towns. Movement could no longer rely solely on grazing cycles. Routes had to follow water. Timing became critical. Mistakes meant death. This altered how the Yuezhi travelled. Migration slowed. Groups became more deliberate, more organised. Leadership structures tightened around those who could manage logistics, negotiate access, and avoid conflict. Central Asia punished chaos. It rewarded planning. Along these routes lay oasis cities, places like Kashgar, Khotan, and further west, the remnants of Hellenistic Bactria. These settlements were not merely stopping points, they were centres of trade, culture, and power. Here, the Yuezhi encountered settled life on a scale they had never ruled, but now had to understand. Caravans moved silk, jade, horses, metals, spices, and ideas. Merchants spoke multiple languages. Coins circulated. Religious symbols mixed freely. Buddhism, local cults, Greek traditions, and Iranian beliefs existed side by side. This exposure changed the Yuezhi worldview. They learned the value of controlling routes rather than land. A city could be bypassed. A trade corridor could not. Whoever protected and taxed movement gained power without walls. This lesson would become foundational. Survival now required diplomacy as much as strength. The Yuezhi negotiated grazing rights near oasis zones, exchanged protection for supplies, and sometimes raided, but rarely without calculation. Violence was no longer an instinctive response. It was a tool used sparingly. They were learning restraint. Over generations, the Yuezhi fractured and regrouped repeatedly. Some groups settled temporarily near trade hubs. Others continued deeper west. Identity remained flexible, but cohesion persisted through kinship and shared memory of displacement. This long migration did not weaken them. It refined them. Contact with Hellenistic culture left visible traces. In Bactria, Greek cities still stood, some decaying, others thriving. Administrative systems, coinage, and urban planning were tangible models of power. The Yuezhi did not immediately adopt these systems, but they observed them closely. They were students before they were rulers. They also encountered other nomadic groups, some hostile, some cooperative. Alliances formed and dissolved, techniques of warfare evolved, equipment changed, horses were bred differently, armour and weapons adapted to new enemies. The Yuezhi were not static nomads anymore, they were becoming a hybrid people. Language too began to shift. Iranian influences mixed with local dialects. Communication across regions required flexibility. Multilingualism became an advantage. Leaders who could negotiate across cultures gained followers. Power now depended on mediation. The Silk Road corridors amplified this process. These routes did not belong to any single empire. They were contested spaces where influence mattered more than ownership. The Yuezhi learned to position themselves as intermediaries, protectors, escorts, and enforcers. This role brought wealth. Gold and silver entered circulation among them. Prestige goods flowed into camps. Social hierarchy deepened. Leaders who controlled access to trade gained authority not just through force, but through distribution. Redistribution replaced raiding as a primary strategy. This shift marked a turning point. A people once defined purely by movement were learning how to anchor power without abandoning mobility. They did not build cities, but they learned how cities worked. They did not mint coins, but they learned what coins meant. Transformation was gradual, not revolutionary. Generations passed along these routes. Children were born who had never seen the eastern steppe their ancestors had fled. Memory of origin became story rather than experience. Identity shifted from displaced to established. still mobile but no longer rootless. The Yuezhi were no longer fleeing, they were positioning. By the time they reached the regions of Bactria and the Oxus River, they were strong, experienced, and deeply entangled in transcontinental exchange. Their leaders commanded followers accustomed to negotiation, protection, and complex logistics. They were ready for permanence, but on their own terms. Central Asia had done its work. It had stripped away isolation. It had introduced complexity. It had forced adaptation without erasing tradition. The Silk Road did not simply carry goods through Yuezhi lands. It reshaped the Yuezhi themselves. It turned survival into strategy and migration into opportunity. What emerged from this long passage was no longer just a nomadic people pushed westward. It was the foundation of an empire that would soon connect China, Central Asia, and India, without ever fully belonging to any one of them. The Kushans were coming into being, and it happened not through conquest, but through movement, across deserts, through mountains, and along the quiet, relentless corridors of trade that stitched the ancient world together. The birth of a new power. Power does not always begin with conquest. Sometimes it begins with agreement. The rise of the Kushans was not marked by a single battle, a dramatic coronation, or the sudden appearance of an empire. It emerged slowly, out of necessity, experience, and adaptation, through the unification of peoples who had spent generations moving, negotiating, and surviving across Central Asia. Before they were Kushans, they were many. The Yuezhi, who had crossed the steppe and deserts of Central Asia, were not a single unified nation. They were a confederation of clans and tribes, loosely connected by shared origin, memory of displacement, and practical cooperation. Leadership was fluid. Authority depended on success. Unity existed, but it was conditional. This kind of organization was strong enough for survival. It was not yet strong enough for empire. Central Asia changed that. By the time the Yuezhi reached the regions of Bactria and the Oxus Basin, the world around them demanded something more stable. They were no longer passing through empty corridors. They now occupied territory filled with cities, trade routes, and established populations accustomed to governance, taxation, and order. Mobility alone was no longer enough. The Yuezhi faced a choice that many nomadic peoples eventually encounter: remain fragmented and vulnerable, or consolidate power and adapt to rule without abandoning their identity. Unification was not ideological, it was practical. Trade routes needed protection. Oasis cities needed predictable authority. Rivals needed to be deterred. Internal disputes needed resolution before they weakened the whole. Gradually, leadership began to concentrate. Some clans gained prominence, not through ancestry alone, but through their ability to manage resources, control routes, and command loyalty. These leaders understood both worlds, the nomadic steppe and the settled urban landscape. They spoke multiple languages. They negotiated rather than simply raided. They distributed wealth to secure allegiance. Power shifted from purely martial strength to administrative capability. This transition did not erase tribal identity. Instead, it layered over it. Clans retained internal autonomy, but external representation became centralized. Decisions affecting trade, war, and diplomacy were increasingly made by a narrower leadership circle. This was the beginning of Kushan authority. The process was gradual and uneven. Some tribes resisted tighter control. Others embraced it, seeing opportunity in stability. Over time, success validated central leadership. Trade increased, security improved, wealth flowed more reliably, results mattered more than theory. The term Kushan itself likely originated as the name of one dominant clan within the broader Yuezhi confederation. As this clan rose in influence, its name came to represent the whole political structure. This is how many steppe empires are born. A name expands as power expands. What distinguished the Kushans was not just unification, but how they unified. They did not attempt to erase difference. They absorbed it. Local elites were incorporated rather than replaced. Existing administrative practices were adopted rather than destroyed. Religious diversity was tolerated rather than suppressed. This flexibility was strategic. Bactria, where Kushan power first solidified, had a long history of governance, from Achaemenid Persians to Greek rulers after Alexander. Cities there understood taxation, bureaucracy, and coinage. Rather than dismantle these systems, the Kushans used them. Nomadic leaders became urban rulers without abandoning mobility. Coinage marks a key turning point. Early Kushan coins reveal a shift in identity. They adopt visual languages familiar to settled populations, royal portraits, symbols of authority, inscriptions, while still reflecting steppe values of power and legitimacy. Minting coins was more than economic. It was political communication. It announced stability. It declared sovereignty. It signalled continuity to merchants and subjects alike. This step alone required centralised authority. You cannot mint coins without control. You cannot control without unity. At the same time, the Kushans retained their advantage as intermediaries. They sat astride the arteries of the Silk Road, connecting China, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Their power was not based on isolating regions, but on linking them. Unification enhanced this role. With centralised leadership, trade corridors could be secured across longer distances. Toll systems could be standardised. Diplomatic relationships could be maintained consistently. The Kushans were not just rulers of land, they were managers of movement. Military organisation evolved alongside political consolidation. Kushan forces blended steppe cavalry traditions with new forms of organisation learned from settled states. Mobility remained central, but coordination improved. Campaigns became more strategic, less reactive. This allowed expansion, not reckless conquest, but controlled growth. As Kushan authority strengthened, their influence spread southward toward the Indian subcontinent. This expansion was not purely military. It involved negotiation with local rulers, adoption of regional practices, and gradual integration. Again, flexibility proved decisive. The Kushans did not impose a single culture. They ruled over many. Greek traditions persisted in some cities. Iranian customs remained strong. Indian religious and social systems were respected. This pluralism was not accidental. A unified empire spanning such diverse regions could not survive on uniformity. It required accommodation. This approach set the Kushans apart from many contemporaries. Where other empires enforced identity, the Kushans curated coexistence. This reduced resistance and increased loyalty. People could live as they had before, so long as trade flowed, and authority was acknowledged. Unification, then, was not about domination, it was about coordination. The Kushan leadership understood that their strength lay in connection. Their empire would not be a single cultural bloc, but a framework holding many worlds together. By the time the Kushans fully emerged as a recognised power, they were no longer just heirs of the Yuezhi migration. They were something new, a hybrid state born of movement, shaped by trade, and sustained by adaptability. They had learned from every land they passed through. From the steppe, they retained mobility and resilience. From Central Asia, they learned mediation and exchange. From Bactria and beyond, they adopted governance and legitimacy. Unification was the synthesis of all these lessons. This birth of power was quiet by imperial standards. There were no triumphant inscriptions proclaiming destiny. There was no single founding moment. Instead, there was competence, and competence over time created authority. By the first century of their rise, the Kushans stood as a new kind of empire. neither purely nomadic nor fully settled, neither eastern nor western, but something between. Their power was not inherited, it was earned, and it was this earned authority, built through unification without erasure, that would allow the Kushans to reach heights few could have imagined when the Yuezhi first fled from the edge of China. The birth of the Kushans was not an accident of history. It was the result of generations learning how to survive movement, how to manage diversity, and how to turn displacement into dominance without forgetting where they came from. That is how a people on the move became an empire between worlds. An empire between worlds. The Kushan Empire did not rise at the centre of a single civilization. It rose between them. Its power did not come from controlling one heartland, one sacred capital, or one ethnic core. It came from geography, complex, demanding, and extraordinarily valuable geography. The Kushans ruled not because they sat at the centre of the ancient world, but because they stood at its intersections. They governed a space where worlds met. To understand Kushan power, one must first understand the land itself. The territory they controlled stretched across some of the most challenging and strategically important landscapes on Earth. The high passes of the Hindu Kush, the fertile valleys of Bactria, the river systems of northern India, and the trade corridors of Central Asia. This was not a single environment. It was many, layered together. Mountains defined the empire's spine. The Hindu Kush range was not simply a barrier, it was a gateway. These mountains separated Central Asia from the Indian subcontinent, but they also contained passes that had been used for millennia by traders, armies, and migrants. Control of these passes meant control of movement. Whoever held them could regulate trade, migration, and military access between north and south. The Kushans understood this deeply. Their power rested not in flattening geography, but in mastering it. Beyond the mountains lay Bactria, a region unlike the open steppe the Kushans' ancestors had once crossed. Bactria was fertile, irrigated, and urbanized. It had known Persian administration, Greek rule after Alexander, and local traditions long before the Kushans arrived. It was already a crossroads. Greek cities still stood there, though transformed. Iranian customs persisted. Trade routes converged. Bactria was accustomed to being ruled, but not by a single dominant culture. This made it ideal for Kushan governance. The Kushans did not need to remake Bactria. They needed to manage it. South of the mountains lay Gandhara and northern India, regions rich in agriculture, population, and spiritual traditions. Rivers sustained cities, monasteries dotted trade routes, merchants moved goods between India and Central Asia continuously. This southern zone added depth to Kushan power. The Kushans now ruled lands that fed empires, not just passed through them. Grain, textiles, and skilled labour flowed north. Luxury goods flowed south. Ideas moved both ways. To the west lay Iran and the Persian plateau, where new powers were emerging. To the east lay the Tarim Basin and the edges of China, connected through fragile but vital Silk Road corridors. The Kushan Empire sat in the middle of all of this, not as an end point, as a connector. This position shaped everything about Kushan rule. They could not afford rigid borders. Borders in such terrain were porous by nature. Trade caravans, pilgrims, nomads, and envoys crossed constantly. Kushan authority had to be flexible enough to allow movement while firm enough to profit from it. They ruled corridors, not lines. This is why the Kushan Empire is often described as a crossroads empire, but this term understates the complexity of their task. A crossroads is not passive, it must be maintained. Roads require security, passes require oversight, cities require cooperation. The Kushans invested in all three. They protected trade routes not by sealing them, but by making them safer than alternatives. Merchants preferred Kushan lands because roads were guarded, tolls were predictable, and local officials were accustomed to diversity. Predictability was power. Geography also shaped Kushan diplomacy. They bordered multiple cultural zones without fully belonging to any. This allowed them to negotiate from a position of neutrality. They could engage with Indian rulers without appearing foreign conquerors. They could trade with Chinese intermediaries without being rivals. They could face Persian powers without being swallowed immediately. They were insiders everywhere and outsiders everywhere. This in-between status was a strength. The Kushans adopted multiple cultural languages at once. Their inscriptions appeared in different scripts. Their coins displayed diverse imagery. Their rulers adopted titles that resonated across regions. This was not confusion, it was strategy. Geography forced pluralism. A ruler who tried to impose a single cultural identity across such varied terrain would fail quickly. The Kushans ruled by alignment rather than uniformity, allowing local traditions to persist so long as imperial authority and trade remained intact. Even their capitals reflected this geography. They did not rely on one fixed centre. Power shifted between cities depending on region and season. Northern administrative centres handled Central Asian affairs. Southern centres governed Indian territories. This flexibility mirrored the landscape itself. Movement remained central, though they ruled. Cities, the Kushans never fully abandoned their nomadic inheritance. They understood that control could be mobile. Royal courts moved, military forces adapted, authority travelled. This made them resilient. When pressure increased in one region, they leaned into another. When routes shifted, they adjusted priorities. Geography did not trap them, it guided them. Trade magnified this advantage. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a network of routes that changed with climate, politics, and demand. The Kushans controlled many of its most critical segments. This allowed them to tax movement, protect merchants, and insert themselves into global exchange without conquering distant lands. Their wealth flowed from position. Gold coins circulated widely under Kushan authority. These coins were accepted across regions precisely because Kushan lands linked so many economies. Currency stability reflected geographic relevance. Ideas moved along the same routes. Buddhism travelled north through Kushan territory. Artistic styles blended Greek, Iranian, and Indian elements. Religious tolerance was not merely philosophical, it was practical in a land where belief systems overlapped constantly. Geography demanded openness. The empire's position also exposed it to danger. Being between worlds meant being pressured from all sides. Nomadic movements from the north, Persian consolidation in the west, and Indian political shifts in the south all tested Kushan stability. But geography also bought time. Mountain barriers slowed invasion, distance complicated enemy logistics. The Kushans could respond asymmetrically, negotiating here, resisting there, retreating when necessary. They were not locked into one strategy. Ultimately, the Kushan Empire was not defined by how much land it ruled, but by which land it ruled. Its strength lay in occupying the hinge points of Eurasia, places where movement was unavoidable. They did not dominate civilizations, they connected them. This made their empire less visible in traditional histories obsessed with capitals and conquests, but it made them essential to the ancient world's functioning. Without Kushan control, trade would have fractured. Without Kushan mediation, cultural exchange would have slowed. Without Kushan geography, East and West would have been farther apart. They were an empire between worlds, not by accident, but by design, shaped by land, sustained by movement, and powerful precisely because they belonged fully to none of the civilizations they connected. Their geography was not just where they ruled, it was how they ruled, and it explains why, for centuries, the Kushans could stand at the centre of ancient globalization, quietly holding together a world that depended on paths rather than palaces. Kings of many lands, Kushan rule and authority. Kushan power did not rest on a single throne, a single capital, or a single people. It rested on authority that could travel across mountains, languages, religions, and traditions without breaking. To rule the Kushan Empire was not to dominate one land, but to coordinate many. Kingship here was less about command from the centre and more about balance across distance. This was an empire that ruled by alignment. The Kushans inherited a world already used to layered authority. In Central Asia and Northern India, people were accustomed to local rulers, city elites, religious institutions, and foreign overlords passing through. Kushan's success came from understanding this reality and working within it rather than against it. They did not erase local power. They stood above it. At the top of the system stood the Kushan king, often styled with titles that emphasized universality rather than locality. Kingship was presented as imperial, not tribal. The ruler was not merely chief of a clan or commander of warriors, but sovereign of many lands, languages, and peoples. This mattered. A king who ruled Gandhara, Bactria, and northern India could not rely on one cultural claim to legitimacy. The Kushans solved this by adopting multiple languages, symbols, and traditions at once. Their authority was deliberately plural. Coins reveal this strategy clearly. Kushan coinage depicts rulers in various guises, sometimes in Central Asian dress, sometimes in Iranian royal style, sometimes accompanied by Greek or Indian deities. Inscriptions appear in different scripts. This was not confusion, it was communication. Each audience saw something familiar. To merchants, the coins promised stability. To local elites, they signalled respect. To rivals, they announced power that transcended borders. Kingship was performative, but carefully so. The Kushan ruler did not claim divine exclusivity the way some later empires would. Instead, he positioned himself as chosen, favoured, or protected by many sacred forces. This allowed different religious communities to accept imperial authority without abandoning their beliefs. Political structure followed the same logic. Below the king, authority was decentralised but coordinated. Local governors, city officials, and regional elites retained their roles. The Kushans did not replace administration wholesale. They supervised it. This reduced resistance. Cities already knew how to collect taxes, manage markets, and maintain order. The Kushans allowed these systems to continue so long as loyalty and revenue flowed upward. Imperial control was real, but light enough to function across vast distances. Military power underpinned this arrangement. The Kushans maintained a strong army, drawing on both nomadic cavalry traditions and settled state organisation. This force was mobile, flexible, and capable of rapid response across regions, but it was not constantly present everywhere. Force was available. It was not omnipresent. This restraint mattered. Overuse of military pressure would have shattered the delicate balance Kushan rule depended on. Instead, military intervention was targeted, used to deter rebellion, protect routes, and assert authority when negotiation failed. Most of the time, authority was maintained through expectation. People paid taxes because the system worked. Merchants travelled because roads were safe. Cities prospered because trade flowed. Kingship became associated with order rather than intrusion. This association strengthened legitimacy. Succession, however, was always a challenge. Like many empires without rigid dynastic law, Kushan succession relied on recognition rather than automatic inheritance. A king needed support from elites, military leaders, and regional authorities. Coins again played a role. New rulers asserted legitimacy by minting currency quickly, making their authority visible. Continuity mattered more than bloodline. As long as the system functioned, few questioned who sat at the top. When it faltered, succession disputes became dangerous. This fragility was the cost of flexibility. Still, For generations, the system held. Kushan rulers also understood the importance of visibility. While they did not rule from a single monumental capital, they invested in symbolic presence, monasteries, urban projects, and patronage that tied imperial authority to prosperity and piety. This was governance by presence, not by enclosure. Kings travelled, courts moved, authority followed routes rather than remaining fixed. This mobility echoed the Kushans' nomadic origins while serving imperial needs. They were rulers who could move between worlds because they had once moved between lands. Imperial control was reinforced by economic integration. By regulating trade corridors, standardizing tolls, and supporting merchant activity, the Kushans embedded themselves into daily economic life. Empire became profitable, not only for rulers, but for those under them. People accepted authority that enriched them. This is why rebellion was relatively rare during the empire's height. There was little incentive to resist a system that delivered stability and growth. Religious patronage further stabilized rule. By supporting multiple faiths, especially Buddhism, the Kushans aligned imperial authority with moral legitimacy. Monasteries became centers of learning, charity, and cultural exchange, all operating under imperial protection. The king was not a distant tax collector, he was a guarantor of order and meaning. This blend of political, economic, and religious authority created a resilient system, one capable of managing extraordinary diversity without collapsing under it. But this system required constant attention, distant, strained communication. Regional power could drift toward autonomy. Success depended on strong rulers capable of managing relationships across thousands of kilometers. When leadership weakened, cracks appeared. Still, at its height, Kushan rule represented one of the ancient world's most sophisticated experiments in plural governance. It was neither rigid nor chaotic. It balanced central authority with local autonomy in a way few empires achieved. The Kushans ruled many lands not by forcing them to become one, but by allowing them to remain many, bound together by shared benefit and overarching authority. This was kingship not as domination, but as coordination, and for centuries it worked, holding together an empire between worlds through a form of power that understood a simple truth. In a connected world, authority must travel as easily as trade. Kanishka the Great, empire at its height, Kushan power reached its fullest expression not through accident, but through a ruler who understood exactly what kind of empire he governed and what it could become. When Kanishka came to power, the Kushan state was already strong, wealthy, and strategically placed. What it lacked was scale, coherence, and vision. Kanishka supplied all three. Under his rule, the Kushan Empire did not merely expand, it crystallized. Kanishka inherited an empire built by adaptation. His predecessors had unified tribes, secured trade routes, and learned to govern across cultures. But these foundations required reinforcement. Distance, diversity, and ambition could just as easily fracture the empire as sustain it. Kanishka's achievement was recognizing this danger and ruling directly against it. He did not attempt to centralize the empire into a rigid structure. Instead, he strengthened its connective tissue, military reach, economic integration, ideological legitimacy, and cultural patronage. His reign represents the moment when the Kushan Empire became a true imperial power rather than a successful confederation. Expansion under Kanishka was strategic, not reckless. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent during his reign, stretching deep into northern India while maintaining control over Central Asian corridors. This expansion was not driven by conquest alone. It was driven by securing zones that mattered, river valleys, trade hubs, and religious centres. Kanishka understood geography. He prioritized regions that reinforced Kushan's strength rather than overextending into marginal lands. Control of northern India brought agricultural wealth, population density, and spiritual influence. Maintaining Central Asian roots ensured trade and revenue. The empire grew inward as much as outward. Military force remained essential, but it was not indiscriminate. Kushan armies under Kanishka combined nomadic cavalry, traditions with increasingly structured command. Mobility allowed rapid deployment across vast distances. Discipline ensured stability after victory. This balance mattered. The Kushan military under Kanishka was not an occupying force in the Roman sense. It functioned as guarantor rather than suppressor. Presence was enough to deter resistance. Violence was reserved for moments when authority was directly challenged. Kanishka's reforms went beyond the battlefield. Administration under his reign became more coherent. Existing local systems were preserved, but imperial oversight strengthened. Taxation became more predictable. Coinage standardized across regions, reinforcing economic unity. Coins again tell the story. Kanishka's coinage is among the most revealing artifacts of his reign. They depict him confidently, sometimes armoured, sometimes robed, projecting authority across cultures. The inscriptions name him clearly, decisively, in scripts legible to different populations. This was deliberate. Coinage was the most widespread imperial medium. Every transaction carried the image of the ruler. Every merchant, farmer, and traveller encountered Kushan authority daily through currency. Economic reform reinforced loyalty. Trade flourished under Kanishka. The Silk Road corridors passing through Kushan territory became safer and more profitable. Merchants preferred Kushan routes because they offered consistency, predictable tolls, protection, and minimal interference. This prosperity fed imperial ambition. Wealth allowed patronage. Patronage allowed legitimacy. Legitimacy allowed expansion without constant coercion. But Kanishka's most enduring reform was ideological. His reign marks a turning point in the religious landscape of Eurasia. While earlier Kushan rulers tolerated multiple faiths, Kanishka elevated one into imperial prominence: Buddhism. This did not mean suppression of other religions. Kanishka did not abandon the pluralism that defined Kushan. Rule. Coins from his reign still depict deities from multiple traditions: Greek, Iranian, Indian. This continuity matters. His support for Buddhism was additive, not exclusive. What changed was scale. Under Kanishka, Buddhism received imperial sponsorship unprecedented in the region. Monasteries expanded, scholars gathered, councils were convened, texts were standardized and transmitted, religion became infrastructure. Buddhism benefited from Kushan geography. Monasteries were built along trade routes, turning spiritual centres into hubs of learning, rest, and exchange. Monks travelled with merchants. Ideas moved with goods. Kanishka understood this synergy. By supporting Buddhism, he strengthened cultural cohesion across his diverse empire without enforcing uniform belief. Buddhism's emphasis on ethical conduct, kingship, and order aligned well with imperial governance. The ruler became protector of the Dharma, not its owner. This relationship enhanced Kanishka's legitimacy, especially in northern India. He was not a foreign conqueror imposing rule, but a patron participating in local spiritual life. The famous Rabatak inscription illustrates this clearly. It records Kanishka's achievements in multiple languages and names the regions under his control. More importantly, it shows a ruler consciously defining his empire, naming lands, peoples, and authority. This is an empire aware of itself. Kanishka did not simply rule, he articulated rule. Cultural production flourished under his patronage. Gandharan art reached new heights, blending Greek realism with Buddhist symbolism. Sculptures of the Buddha took on human form with clarity and consistency that would shape Buddhist art for centuries. This was not aesthetic accident. Imperial support standardized iconography. Art became a tool of communication across regions. A traveller could recognize the Buddha whether in Gandhara or farther east. Visual language unified spiritual experience. This cultural coherence reinforced political stability. Kanishka's court reflected the empire he ruled. It was multilingual, multi-ethnic, and mobile. Advisors came from different traditions. Decisions balanced competing interests. This court culture allowed Kushan rule to remain responsive rather than rigid, but such a system depended heavily on the ruler. Kanishka's personal authority held the balance together. His military credibility, economic competence, and religious patronage reinforced one another. Few rulers could have managed such complexity successfully. This made his reign exceptional and fragile, yet for the duration of his rule, the empire thrived. Trade reached unprecedented volumes. Cultural exchange intensified. Kushan authority was respected across borders. Chinese sources noted their power. Indian traditions remembered their patronage. Central Asian rotes flourished. The Kushan Empire under Kanishka became a keystone of ancient globalization. He did not seek to conquer Rome or China. He positioned his empire between them. That positioning was ambition in its own right. Kanishka's imperial ambition was not about domination of the world. It was about relevance to it. He understood that controlling connection could be more powerful than controlling territory. In this, he succeeded. When later generations looked back, they remembered Kanishka not simply as a ruler, but as a defining figure, one who brought coherence, confidence, and clarity to an empire born of movement. After him, the Kushan system endured, but never with the same intensity. The balance he maintained would eventually strain under external pressure and internal succession challenges. But at its height, under Kanishka the Great, the Kushan Empire achieved something rare. It became an empire of connection rather than conquest, of patronage rather than suppression, of pluralism held together by authority. This was the moment when the Kushans stood not merely between worlds, but at the massive centre of them, and it was Kanishka who made that possible. Trade that linked the ancient world. Trade did not simply pass through the Kushan Empire. It was organised, protected, taxed, encouraged, and transformed there. The Kushans did not become powerful because they conquered the ancient world's great cities. They became powerful because they sat astride the arteries that kept those cities alive. Their empire linked regions that rarely trusted one another, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and followed different laws. What bound them together was movement, and the Kushans learned how to profit from it. This was commerce as statecraft. At the centre of Kushan prosperity lay a vast network later called the Silk Road, not a single road, but a web of land and sea routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean and from the steppes to the Indian Ocean. The Kushan Empire controlled many of its most critical junctions. That position changed everything. Before Kushan dominance, trade across Central Asia was fragile. Routes shifted with politics, climate and conflict. Merchants faced constant risk from banditry, arbitrary tolls, and warfare. Long-distance exchange existed, but it was inconsistent and dangerous. The Kushans made it reliable. They did not eliminate risk. They managed it. By securing mountain passes, guarding caravan routes, and standardizing taxation, the Kushans made their territory preferable to alternatives. Merchants could plan journeys months in advance. Contracts became enforceable. Credit networks expanded. Trust, rare in the ancient world, slowly grew. Predictability became a commodity. The Kushans understood that controlling movement mattered more than controlling production. They did not need to manufacture silk, spices, or glass. They needed to ensure those goods moved safely through their lands. This insight reshaped imperial economics. Caravans crossing Kushan territory carried Chinese silk, Central Asian horses, Indian textiles, spices, gemstones, Roman glassware, wine and metalwork. Ideas travelled with them. Religious texts, artistic styles, technologies, and scientific knowledge. The Kushans taxed this movement carefully. Tolls were not random. They were calibrated. Too high, and merchants rerouted. Too low, and revenue suffered. Kushan administrators learned to balance extraction with encouragement. This balance sustained prosperity. Gold flowed into the empire, not only as tribute or plunder, but as payment for services, protection, infrastructure, arbitration. Kushan wealth was transactional rather than extractive. This distinction matters. Empires built on conquest often burn through wealth quickly. Empires built on exchange accumulate it steadily. The Kushans belong to the latter category. Coinage played a crucial role. The Kushans minted large quantities of high-quality gold coins, among the most stable and widely accepted currencies of the ancient world. These coins circulated far beyond imperial borders, accepted by merchants, from India to Central Asia. Trust in currency reflected trust in authority. Kushan coins were consistent in weight and purity. This reliability made them attractive in long-distance trade, where uncertainty could ruin fortunes. Merchants preferred Kushan gold because it reduced risk. The imagery on these coins reinforced legitimacy. Rulers appeared confident and recognizable. Deities from multiple traditions appeared alongside royal portraits. Inscriptions communicated authority across linguistic boundaries. Coins spoke where armies could not. They crossed borders peacefully, carrying imperial presence into markets far from any Kushan garrison. Every transaction became a reminder of who guaranteed stability. Trade reshaped urban life. Cities within Kushan territory expanded rapidly. Markets grew, warehouses multiplied, crafts flourished. Urban populations became more diverse as merchants from different regions settled temporarily or permanently. These cities were not isolated islands. They were nodes. Each node connected multiple routes, north to Central Asia, south to India, west toward Iran, east toward China. Kushan cities thrived not because they dominated their hinterlands, but because they connected worlds. Prosperity extended beyond merchants. Farmers benefited from increased demand. Artisans found new markets. Transport workers, guides, camel drivers, guards found steady employment. Entire communities oriented themselves around trade cycles. The empire's wealth became distributed. This distribution reduced unrest. People tolerated imperial authority because it brought opportunity. Taxes were the price of participation in a broader economy. Religion, too, benefited from trade. Monasteries sprang up along caravan routes, offering rest, food, and spiritual support to travellers. Buddhism, in particular, spread rapidly along Kushan-controlled corridors, not by force, but by proximity. Merchants carried texts. Monks travelled with caravans. Artistic styles moved freely. Trade was cultural transmission. The Kushans recognized this and supported it. Religious institutions stabilized routes. Pilgrims and traders reinforced one another. Spiritual legitimacy strengthened imperial authority without coercion. This symbiosis was deliberate. The Kushans did not impose belief, but they enabled its movement. That movement created shared reference points across diverse populations, ethical norms, visual symbols, stories. Commerce created cohesion. The Indian Ocean trade amplified Kushan prosperity further. Southern Kushan territories connected inland routes to maritime networks reaching Arabia, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. Goods arriving by sea flowed north through Kushan lands. Goods from Central Asia flowed south to ports. The Kushans became intermediaries between land and sea. This multiplied revenue without expanding territory. It also insulated the empire from regional downturns. If one route suffered disruption, others compensated. Diversification was resilience. Trade also shaped diplomacy. The Kushans maintained relations with distant powers not primarily through warfare, but through commerce. Trade agreements, gift exchanges, and diplomatic missions stabilized borders. Rival powers had incentives to cooperate. Disrupting Kushan trade hurt everyone. This gave the Kushans leverage disproportionate to their military footprint. Their power lay in indispensability, yet prosperity carried risks. Wealth attracted envy. Routes attracted rivals. The same corridors that brought gold could bring armies. Maintaining trade required constant vigilance. The Kushans invested heavily in security. Garrisons protected critical passes. Patrols monitored routes. Local leaders were co-opted to maintain order. Disputes were mediated quickly to prevent escalation. Stability was labour. As long as Kushan leadership remained strong, the system functioned. When leadership weakened, cracks appeared. Trade declined. Confidence eroded. Routes shifted. Commerce was loyal, but only to competence. Still, for centuries, Kushan trade knit together regions that might otherwise have remained isolated. Their empire did not just benefit from ancient globalization, it made it possible at scale. Without Kushan stewardship, the Silk Road would have fractured into regional exchanges. With it, Eurasia experienced sustained connectivity. The Kushans proved that power did not always require domination. Sometimes it required facilitation. They ruled by making movement easier rather than harder, by making exchange safer rather than rarer, by understanding that prosperity, once shared, becomes loyalty. Trade linked the ancient world, but it was the Kushans who held those links together, quietly turning geography into wealth, wealth into authority, and authority into one of the most influential empires of its age. Gods of many faiths. Religion in the Kushan Empire. Religion in the Kushan Empire was not a boundary, it was a bridge. The Kushans ruled one of the most religiously diverse regions the ancient world had ever known. Their lands stretched across Central Asia and northern India, touching worlds shaped by Iranian traditions, Indian philosophies, Greek cosmology, and countless local cults rooted in landscape and community. In most empires, such diversity became a source of conflict. Under the Kushans, it became a source of stability. This was not accidental tolerance, it was strategic pluralism. The Kushans inherited a geography where belief systems overlapped rather than replaced one another. Trade routes carried gods as easily as goods. Merchants prayed in one shrine on departure and another on arrival. Travellers adapted without contradiction. The Kushans understood that enforcing a single religious identity across this terrain would fracture the empire, so they did not choose exclusivity, they chose accommodation. At the heart of Kushan, religious policy was recognition rather than conversion. The empire did not ask its subjects to abandon their gods. It asked them to accept imperial authority as something that existed above religious difference. This subtle distinction mattered. Rather than claiming divine monopoly, Kushan rulers presented themselves as favoured by many sacred forces at once. Their legitimacy rested not on one doctrine, but on the idea that the empire itself was divinely supported through harmony. Coinage again reveals this worldview with striking clarity. Kushan coins depict a remarkable array of deities. Greek gods appear beside Iranian divine figures. Indian deities share space with Buddhist symbols. Inscriptions labelled them carefully, often in multiple scripts. This was not decoration, it was political theology. Every coin passed from hand to hand carried a message. The empire recognised your god. Your belief had a place within Kushan. Rule. Imperial authority did not threaten sacred identity, it validated it. This approach reduced resistance. A farmer in northern India did not see Kushan rule as a foreign imposition on belief. A merchant from Central Asia did not feel spiritually displaced. A Greek-descended urban elite could still recognize familiar divine imagery. Religious continuity became political loyalty. Among these many faiths, Buddhism gained particular prominence during the height of the empire, especially under Kanishka. But even this prominence must be understood carefully. Buddhism was not made exclusive, it was amplified. The Kushans recognized that Buddhism offered something uniquely suited to their imperial needs. It was portable, it was ethical rather than territorial. It encouraged literacy, monastic organization, and long-distance travel. Its monasteries functioned as hubs of learning, rest, and charity, perfectly aligned with trade networks. Supporting Buddhism strengthened infrastructure. Monasteries were built along routes that merchants travelled. Monks moved between regions, carrying texts and teachings. Artistic traditions developed that could be understood across cultures. Buddhism did not replace local beliefs, it layered over them. In many regions, Buddhist practice coexisted with older traditions. Local deities were incorporated into Buddhist cosmology. Rituals adapted. This flexibility mirrored the Kushan approach to governance itself. Hindu traditions also flourished within Kushan lands. Northern India already possessed deep religious systems centered on ritual, caste, and devotion. The Kushans did not disrupt these structures. They patronized temples, respected local customs, and allowed religious authorities to maintain influence. This continuity was essential. Agricultural societies depend heavily on ritual cycles tied to seasons and land. Interfering with these systems would have caused unrest. The Kushans understood this and left such rhythms intact. Greek religious influence persisted as well. In regions once ruled by Hellenistic kingdoms, Greek gods remained familiar. Their imagery continued to appear in art and coinage, sometimes transformed, sometimes preserved. Over time, these gods blended with local interpretations, becoming less purely Greek and more regional. This blending did not concern the Kushans. They did not seek doctrinal purity, they sought functionality. If a belief system supported social order, ethical conduct, and acceptance of authority, it was useful. Iranian religious traditions also remained influential, especially in Central Asian regions closer to the empire's northern core. Fire symbolism, cosmic order, and moral dualism shaped local practice and royal ideology. Kushan kingship absorbed these ideas subtly. The ruler was presented as guarantor of order rather than enforcer of belief. He upheld balance between sacred forces rather than claiming divine exclusivity. Religion became a language of legitimacy. This pluralism did not mean absence of hierarchy. Imperial patronage mattered. Faiths that aligned well with trade, literacy, and mobility, like Buddhism, received more visible support. Others remained local and less connected to imperial institutions, but none were suppressed systematically. This restraint distinguished the Kushans from many later empires. Their religious tolerance was not modern in motivation, it was pragmatic. In a world where identity was deeply tied to belief, tolerance prevented rebellion. More importantly, it allowed the empire to function across vast distances without constant enforcement. Faith travelled freely under Kushan rule. Pilgrims crossed borders without fear. Scholars debated across traditions. Art evolved through exchange. This openness created one of the most vibrant religious landscapes of the ancient world. Gandharan art stands as a testament to this environment. Here, Buddhist imagery adopted Greek realism. Sculptures depicted the Buddha with Hellenistic features, draped in robes reminiscent of classical statuary. This was not dilution, it was translation. Art became a shared language. Such visual synthesis allowed religious ideas to cross cultural boundaries. A merchant from the West could recognize form. A devotee from the East could recognize meaning. Religion became accessible. This accessibility reinforced imperial cohesion. Shared symbols emerged without shared dogma. People recognized each other's sacred spaces without needing to convert. The Kushans did not unify belief, they unified recognition. Religious institutions also played a role in governance. Monasteries and temples acted as local anchors of authority. They mediated disputes, provided charity, and reinforced ethical norms. By protecting these institutions, the Kushans extended imperial influence indirectly. The empire ruled through trust networks rather than direct oversight. This system had limits. Religious diversity required careful balance. Favouring one tradition too strongly risked alienating others. Kushan rulers walked this line deliberately, adjusting patronage region by region. When leadership weakened, religious cohesion could fray, but during the empire's height, the system held. The Kushan Empire demonstrated something rare in ancient history, that religious diversity, when managed wisely, could strengthen rather than weaken imperial power. They did not ask, which God is true? They asked, which beliefs allow people to live together? In doing so, they created a world where monks, merchants, pilgrims, and rulers shared roads, markets, and sacred spaces without constant conflict. Their legacy is not a single religion, but a model of coexistence, one that allowed ideas to travel farther and faster than armies ever could. In the Kushan world, faith did not divide empires, it connected them. The birth of Buddhist art. The birth of Buddhist art was not a sudden revelation. It was a slow negotiation between cultures, beliefs, and ways of seeing the world. For centuries after the death of the Buddha, his presence was not shown in human form. Early Buddhist communities avoided depicting him directly. Instead, they used symbols, a footprint, an empty throne, a wheel, a tree. The Buddha was understood as beyond physical form, and to represent him as a man was considered unnecessary, even improper. Then something changed. That change did not begin in India's heartland, nor in a royal court, nor through religious decree. It began at the crossroads of empires, in a region shaped by conquest, trade, and cultural blending. That region was Gandhara. Gandhara sat at the meeting point of worlds. It lay between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, along the great routes that carried caravans, pilgrims, and ideas across Eurasia. For centuries it had been ruled by Persians, Greeks, local dynasties, and finally the Kushans. Each left behind traces, languages, artistic traditions, religious ideas. This layered history mattered. By the time the Kushans rose to power, Gandhara was already accustomed to cultural synthesis. Greek artistic realism coexisted with Indian religious thought. Sculptors trained in Hellenistic traditions lived alongside Buddhist monks and patrons. Under Kushan rule, these worlds finally fused. The Kushans did not invent Buddhist art from nothing. They created the conditions in which it could emerge. Their empire connected regions, protected trade routes, and encouraged religious institutions. Buddhism flourished under their patronage, and with growth came the need for visual expression. Religion needed images. As monasteries expanded and pilgrimage increased, Buddhist communities required ways to communicate teachings to diverse audiences, many of whom did not share language or background. Visual storytelling became essential. Art became teaching. In Gandhara, sculptors began to depict the Buddha as a human figure for the first time in a consistent, recognizable way. This was revolutionary. The Buddha was no longer only symbolized, he was seen. The form they chose was shaped by the world around them. Gandharan Buddhas wear robes that resemble Greek togas with deep naturalistic folds. Their faces show calm realism, proportioned features, thoughtful expressions, wavy hair gathered in a top knot. The influence of Hellenistic sculpture is unmistakable. This was not imitation, it was translation. Greek artistic techniques were used to express Buddhist ideals. Realism served spirituality. The human form became a vessel for enlightenment. This mattered profoundly. By depicting the Buddha as human, Gandharan artists made his story accessible. He became someone who could be encountered, remembered, and followed. His life, suffering, and awakening could be visualized. The abstract became personal. Sacred imagery expanded rapidly. Reliefs carved into stone told stories from the Buddha's life. His birth, renunciation, enlightenment, teaching, and death. These scenes were arranged sequentially, allowing viewers to follow narratives visually. This mirrored the movement of trade routes. Just as merchants travelled from city to city, stories travelled from relief to relief. Monasteries became galleries of instruction. Pilgrims learned through sight as much as sound. Art democratized religion. The Kushans supported this transformation. Imperial patronage funded monasteries, stupas and workshops. Sculptors found steady work. Materials circulated. Artistic standards spread across regions. This support was not about imposing belief. It was about enabling expression. The Kushans understood that visual culture strengthened religious cohesion without coercion. Art allowed Buddhism to speak across languages, making it ideal for an empire defined by diversity. Gandharan art also absorbed local traditions. Indian symbols remained central. The lotus, the wheel, gestures of teaching and reassurance. Iranian influences appeared in motifs of authority and cosmic order. The result was not a single style, but a family of related forms. Unity without uniformity. As these images spread along trade routes, they influenced Buddhist art far beyond Gandhara. Sculptural traditions moved eastward into Central Asia and China, and southward into the Indian subcontinent. The Gandharan Buddha became a template. Even as styles evolved, the idea of the Buddha as a human figure endured. The decision made in Gandhara reshaped Buddhist visual culture across Asia for centuries. This artistic shift also changed how people related to the Buddha. Seeing him depicted as calm, composed, and compassionate invited emotional connection. Devotion deepened. Rituals adapted. Offerings were made to images, not just symbols. Art reshaped practice. Critically, this transformation did not erase earlier traditions. Symbolic representations continued alongside figural ones. Buddhism expanded rather than replaced its visual language. This flexibility echoed Kushan governance. Just as the empire ruled through accommodation, Buddhist art grew through synthesis. Workshops in Gandhara became centres of innovation. Apprentices learned techniques that blended carving, proportion, and narrative composition. These skills travelled with artisans, spreading style and method across regions. Art followed trade. The durability of stone ensured survival. While texts were lost and buildings collapsed, sculptures endured. Today, Gandharan art offers one of the clearest windows into the Kushan world. Its beliefs, values, and cultural confidence. These statues were not mass-produced propaganda. They were acts of devotion. Each figure reflects time, labour, and intention. The artists were not merely craftsmen, they were interpreters of belief. The birth of Buddhist art was not about aesthetics alone. It marked a shift in how spirituality was communicated. Enlightenment became visible. Teaching became embodied. Faith became approachable. None of this would have been possible without the Kushan world that enabled it. Without stable trade routes, materials would not move. Without religious tolerance, patronage would not exist. Without cultural openness, synthesis would not occur. The Kushans did not dictate what Buddhist art should look like. They allowed it to emerge, and in doing so, they changed religious history. From Gandhara outward, the Buddha gained a face, and through that face, Buddhism gained new reach. The images born at this crossroads of empire travelled farther than armies, endured longer than rulers, and spoke across centuries. This was the quiet power of art in the Kushan age. It did not conquer, it connected, and in stone and silence, it carried the sacred across the ancient world, long after the empire that nurtured it had faded from memory. Life inside the Kushan world. Life inside the Kushan world was not defined by a single way of living. It unfolded differently in cities and villages, along trade routes and river valleys, in monasteries and workshops. What united these lives was not shared language or belief, but participation in a system that valued movement, exchange, and coexistence. The Kushan Empire was not an empire of one capital. It was an empire of many lives. Cities formed the visible anchors of Kushan society. Places like those in Bactria and Gandhara were already old when the Kushans arrived. They had markets, temples, workshops, and administrative traditions shaped by Persian, Greek, and local rule. Under the Kushans, these cities did not lose their character, they gained new purpose. Urban life revolved around exchange. Markets were the heart of the city. Merchants sold silk, spices, gemstones, textiles, metal goods, and everyday necessities. Coins changed hands constantly, linking local trade to long-distance commerce. People from distant regions lived side by side, some permanently, others only while passing through. Cities spoke many languages. This diversity was normal. A merchant might bargain in one tongue, pray in another, and pay taxes in a third. Kushan authorities did not try to standardize speech or custom. What mattered was participation in the economic and civic order. Merchants were among the most influential figures in Kushan society. They were not merely traders. They were carriers of information, culture, and credit. Their networks extended beyond imperial borders. A merchant's success depended on stability, and stability depended on Kushan rule. This made merchants natural allies of the empire. Many merchants sponsored religious institutions, especially monasteries, which offered lodging, security, and moral legitimacy. This patronage strengthened ties between commerce and faith, embedding trade into daily life. Beyond the cities lay farmland, the quiet foundation of prosperity. Farmers worked river valleys and irrigated fields, especially in northern India. Their lives followed seasonal rhythms, planting, tending, harvesting. While distant from imperial courts, they were deeply affected by imperial order. Stable governance meant predictable taxation. Predictable taxation meant survival. The Kushans generally left village life intact. Local leaders managed land and labour. Traditional practices continued. The empire's presence was felt through tax collectors and trade demand rather than daily interference. This light touch reduced unrest. Farmers sold surplus to markets that had grown larger and richer under Kushan trade. Agricultural goods moved farther than before. Some villages became specialised suppliers for cities or caravans. Rural life connected to global exchange. Artisans occupied a middle space between city and countryside. Workshops produced pottery, metalwork, textiles, jewellery and sculpture. Some artisans served local needs. Others worked on commission for religious institutions or wealthy patrons. In regions like Gandhara, sculptors carved stone images that would travel far beyond their place of origin. Skill moved with people. Artisans learned techniques from different traditions. Styles blended. A craftsman might use Greek-inspired realism to depict Buddhist themes using Indian symbolism. This was not confusion, it was creativity born of contact. Daily life for artisans was structured by demand. Trade prosperity meant steady work. Imperial patronage meant prestige. Religious sponsorship meant continuity. Households were extended and practical. Families often lived together across generations. Work and home overlapped. Women managed households, participated in trade, and in some cases owned property or sponsored religious donations. Social roles varied by region, but flexibility was common. This adaptability mirrored the empire itself. Religion shaped daily routines without dominating them. People visited shrines, made offerings, observed festivals, and supported monasteries. Belief was woven into life rather than enforced from above. A person could honour local gods while respecting Buddhist ethics and recognising imperial authority. Faith was layered, not exclusive. Travel was common. Caravans moved constantly. Pilgrims journeyed to sacred sites. Officials travelled between regions. Roads and passes were busy. Inns, monasteries, and markets catered to travellers, creating a culture accustomed to strangers. Movement was normal. Even the poor encountered the wider world through goods, stories, and ideas brought by travellers. Isolation was rare. The Kushan world felt connected, even in remote areas. Social hierarchy existed, but it was not rigidly uniform. Wealth mattered, status mattered, but opportunity existed through trade, service, and patronage. A successful merchant could gain influence. A skilled artisan could earn respect. A monastery could elevate humble origins. This fluidity reduced resentment. Life inside the Kushan world was not peaceful everywhere. Hardship existed. Drought, disease, and conflict touched many lives. But compared to regions fractured by constant war, Kushan lands offered continuity. People planned for the future. Children grew up expecting stability. Crafts passed from parent to child. Villages endured. Cities expanded. Religious institutions accumulated memory and learning. This continuity was Kushan power in its most human form. The empire did not announce itself daily through soldiers or decrees. It was felt in the regularity of markets, the safety of roads, the acceptance of difference. The Kushans ruled by making life workable. When later pressures came, new rivals, shifting trade, internal strain, it was this everyday fabric that frayed first. But at its height, life inside the Kushan world represented one of antiquity's most successful experiments in connected living. Not everyone prospered equally, but most belonged. And belonging in a world of movement and difference was the Kushan's greatest achievement. Pressure from Persia and the steppe. Pressure rarely announces itself with a single invasion or a dramatic collapse. More often, it arrives quietly, through shifting borders, broken routes, contested loyalties, and rivals who grow stronger while an empire is still functioning. This was how the Kushan world began to strain, not through sudden defeat, but through pressure applied from multiple directions at once. The Kushans did not fall because they failed to rule. They faltered because the world around them changed. By the 3rd century, the balance that had sustained Kushan power for generations was no longer stable. The same geography that had once made them indispensable now exposed them to converging threats. One from the west, rooted in revived Persian power, and another from the north and east, driven by steppe movements that never truly stopped. The first great pressure came from Persia. To the west of Kushan territory, a new force emerged, the Sassanid dynasty. Unlike the Parthians before them, the Sassanids were not content with loose control and negotiated boundaries. They sought restoration of Persian kingship, authority, and imperial centralization. This ambition mattered. The Sassanids viewed the lands once held by earlier Persian empires as rightfully theirs. Bactria and neighbouring regions were not foreign territories to be tolerated, but lost domains to be reclaimed. Where the Kushans ruled through coordination, the Sassanids ruled through assertion. Two imperial philosophies collided. The Kushan system depended on pluralism, trade, and mediation. The Sassanid system emphasized hierarchy, ideological kingship, and tighter control. This made coexistence increasingly difficult. Conflict did not begin immediately with open war. It began with pressure. Trade routes shifted westward. Diplomatic relations hardened. Sassanid forces tested boundaries. Local elites in western Kushan territories found themselves caught between two powers offering different futures. Some hedged their loyalty. This gradual erosion weakened Kushan cohesion. Authority that depended on balance now faced a rival that demanded alignment. In contested zones, Kushan rule began to thin. The creation of Kushano-Sasanian territories marks this transition clearly. These regions were not conquered outright. They were restructured. Sassanid rulers placed their own governors while retaining some Kushan administrative forms. Coinage blended imagery. Authority became ambiguous. Ambiguity is dangerous for empires. Once authority becomes negotiable, fragmentation accelerates. Local rulers learned they could play one power against another. Loyalty became transactional rather than stable. At the same time, pressure built from the steppe. The northern and eastern frontiers of the Kushan world had never been static. Nomadic movements continued across Central Asia, new groups rising as older ones declined. These peoples were not unified empires, but shifting, confederations driven by climate, opportunity, and competition. They did not seek Kushan ideology, they sought space. As steppe pressure increased, trade routes became less predictable. Security costs rose. The Kushans had built their empire on managed movement. Now movement became harder to manage. The old advantage became a vulnerability. Kushan military forces, once sufficient to deter disruption, were now stretched thin. Defending multiple corridors across vast terrain required resources and coordination that weakened leadership struggled to maintain. Succession disputes compounded the problem. As strong rulers passed, authority fractured among competing claimants. Coinage reveals this instability. Regional mints issued in different names, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting one another. This signalled uncertainty. Merchants noticed. Allies hesitated. Rivals advanced cautiously, testing for weakness. The Sassanids pressed harder. Western Kushan lands fell increasingly under Persian influence. Fortifications appeared where none had been necessary before. Trade that once flowed freely now required negotiation across rival spheres. This slowed exchange, the lifeblood of Kushan power. Without steady trade, imperial revenues declined. Without revenue, patronage faltered. Religious institutions lost support. Urban centres stagnated. Pressure translated into fragmentation. The empire did not shatter instantly. It thinned. Peripheral regions drifted away first. Central authority became more symbolic than practical. What remained was a core holding on, smaller, poorer, and more defensive. This transformation was not unique. Many empires that thrive on connectivity struggle when networks break. The Kushans had not built walls or rigid borders. When corridors closed, they had few alternatives. Yet even in decline, adaptation continued. Some Kushan elites aligned with Sassanid power, others integrated into emerging regional states. Religious institutions persisted independently of imperial support. Buddhist networks, once nurtured by Kushan stability, continued their work even as political order shifted. Legacy outlived rule. The steppe pressures did not end with Kushan decline. New waves of movement reshaped Central Asia again and again. But the Kushans were no longer positioned to manage these changes. Their moment had passed. What replaced them was not emptiness, but transformation. Persian authority expanded west of the Hindu Kush. Indian polities absorbed former Kushan lands to the south. Nomadic influences reshaped the north. The Kushan world dissolved into its components. This is why the end of the Kushans feels quiet in historical memory. There was no final sack of a capital, no dramatic fall recorded in chronicles. Instead, authority faded as pressure accumulated. Empires built on balance require balance to survive. When that balance tipped, when Persia hardened to the west and the steppe stirred to the north, the Kushans could no longer hold the centre. Their fragmentation was not failure, it was consequence. They had connected worlds for centuries. When those worlds pulled apart, the connectors broke first. And yet, even under pressure, their influence remained in trade patterns, religious art, administrative habits, and cultural exchange. The Kushans did not vanish. They were absorbed into the new order they had helped shape. Pressure from Persia and the steppe did not erase them. It transformed them into history. The empire that faded. Kushan. Legacy. The Kushan Empire did not end with a final battle, a fallen capital, or a last emperor dragged from a throne. It faded, slowly, unevenly, into the worlds it had once connected. Its authority thinned, its borders softened, and its name slipped from power. Yet its influence remained everywhere. This is the paradox of the Kushans. They ruled by connection rather than domination, and so when their rule receded, what they had connected did not break apart. It continued, carrying Kushan ideas forward into India, Central Asia, religious traditions, and long-distance trade networks that would outlive the empire itself. Their legacy is quieter than conquest, but it is deeper. In India, the Kushan imprint was profound. When Kushan political authority weakened in the north, it did not leave chaos behind. Instead, it left structures. Urban centres that had grown under Kushan rule continued to function. Trade networks remained active. Religious institutions endured. Later Indian polities did not need to rebuild from nothing. They inherited a world already integrated. The emergence of the Gupta period, often remembered as a classical age of Indian culture, was shaped in part by Kushan groundwork. The Kushans had normalized large-scale trade, stable coinage, and imperial patronage of religion and learning. They had also accustomed northern India to engagement with Central Asia rather than isolation from it. This outward orientation mattered. Kushan rule had linked India to broader Eurasian systems, economically, culturally, and spiritually. Indian merchants travelled farther. Indian religious ideas moved outward with greater ease. Indian art absorbed foreign techniques and reinterpreted them locally. The Kushans did not make India dependent on the outside world, they made it connected to it. Buddhism represents the most visible and enduring Kushan legacy. While Buddhism did not originate under Kushan rule, it transformed. Because of it, the Kushans provided the conditions that allowed Buddhism to become a trans-regional faith rather than a primarily South Asian one. Monasteries along trade routes flourished under Kushan protection. Pilgrims travelled safely, scholars debated across regions, texts circulated, artistic standards emerged that made the Buddha recognizable across cultures. The human image of the Buddha, first fully realized in Gandhara, became canonical. This alone reshaped Buddhist devotion across Asia. When Buddhism spread into Central Asia, China, and eventually East Asia, it carried visual and institutional forms forged in the Kushan world. In this sense, Kushan decline did not weaken Buddhism, it released it. As imperial support faded, Buddhist networks proved resilient. Monasteries were already self-sustaining. Trade routes still functioned. Religious communities adapted to new political patrons without losing continuity. The faith outlived the empire that helped carry it. In Central Asia, Kushan legacy appeared less as memory and more as habit. The Kushans had normalized the idea that Central Asia was not a periphery, but a centre, a place where empires met, where trade mattered more than territory, and where cultural blending was not weakness but strength. Later powers inherited this logic, even as new rulers, Persian, nomadic, or regional, asserted control. They operated within corridors the Kushans had stabilized. Trade routes continued to follow paths Kushan administrators had protected. Cities continued to function as nodes rather than capitals. The Kushans had taught Central Asia how to be a crossroads. This lesson endured. In trade, the Kushan legacy was structural. They had helped turn the Silk Road from a fragile chain of exchanges into a sustained system. By standardizing coinage, securing routes, and integrating land and sea networks, they made long-distance commerce dependable. Even after their political decline, merchants continued to prefer established routes. Trust, once built, is slow to disappear. Kushan gold coins remained in circulation long after Kushan authority faded, valued for their purity and reliability. Economic memory outlives political memory. Trade did not collapse with the empire. It adjusted. Other powers stepped in, but they inherited networks already in motion. The Kushans had lowered the cost of distance. Culturally, the Kushan world normalized hybridity. Art that blended Greek realism with Indian spirituality did not remain confined to Gandhara. Its influence spread into Central Asia and beyond. Architectural ideas, sculptural techniques, and narrative reliefs continued to evolve along Kushan established routes. This blending shaped later artistic traditions across Asia. The Kushans demonstrated that cultural synthesis could be productive rather than destabilizing. This lesson reappears repeatedly in regions influenced by their rule. Even in governance, echoes remained. Later states adopted similar approaches to ruling diverse populations, balancing local autonomy with imperial oversight, tolerating religious plurality, and prioritizing economic integration over cultural uniformity. The Kushans were not remembered as lawgivers or empire builders in later chronicles, but their methods were quietly reused. This is why their disappearance feels incomplete. They did not leave behind a single successor empire that claimed their mantle. Instead, their influence was absorbed by many. Each took a piece: trade, art, religion, administration, and carried it forward independently. The Kushans dissolved into continuity. This kind of legacy is difficult to commemorate. There are no monuments declaring Kushan greatness. No epic poems celebrate their kings. No capital city stands as a symbol of their power. But their absence of monuments reflects their strength. They invested in systems rather than symbols, in movement rather than walls, in connection rather than conquest. When those systems proved useful, others kept them alive. Empires that fade quietly often last the longest. The Kushans remind us that history is not only shaped by those who conquer and impose, it is also shaped by those who enable, who make exchange possible, who allow ideas to move, who create spaces where different worlds can meet without destroying one another. Their empire faded because the world changed. Their influence endured because it still worked. In India, in Central Asia, in Buddhist art and practice, and in the deep memory of Eurasian trade, the Kushans remain present, not as rulers, but as facilitators of connection. They were an empire between worlds, and when they disappeared, the worlds they had joined did not fall apart. They continued, carrying Kushan influence forward, quietly shaping history long after the empire itself had become a name remembered only by scholars. That is the legacy of the Kushans, not domination, but transformation. The Kushans did not fall in a single moment. They did not vanish through conquest or collapse. Their empire faded as the world around them changed, but the systems they built endured. Trade routes remained active, religious traditions continued to spread, and the cultural connections they forged outlived their rule. They were not remembered through monuments or epics, but through influence, felt in Buddhist art, in commerce between continents, and in the idea that empires could thrive through connection rather than domination. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the Kushan world, like the video, subscribe for more in-depth history, and let us know in the comments which civilization you'd like to explore next.